Okay, here we are, second day of oral history interviews with Scott Owen.
Hi, Jono.
It's January 5th, 2025. I don't know, trying to make this sound more professional than it is.
Well, let me get out some transcripts and go over those. Some legal opinions.
So we left off yesterday. You with Shannon. You were living in Tucson with Ty and one-armed Bob and Shannon had just left. And I guess let's just go ahead and pick up the story from there.
Yeah, you were curious about one-armed Bob, and I don't mean to, he was a human. He was a person that had a lot of problems in his life. He wasn't particularly consequential to anything I was doing, except for that he made our house. It was me and Shannon and Ty, and Ty had a girlfriend named Jackie Farina, and she kind of showed up occasionally. So it was just us there in our little house doing our little thing. But then when Bob would show up, it would kind of turn into like a junkie pad, sort of.
Yeah.
Because that's what they were doing, they were sitting around shooting heroin, and I hated it. They both would become real. I don't like being around people on that kind of drug. They would become mean, and they are just real negative about everything. Everything they said was kind of mean and nasty, and for some reason the heroin makes you think you know everything. That's what I've heard, and so you get this like holier than thou kind of attitude towards everybody around you. And that's kind of how it was to be around them, and I didn't like it, Shannon didn't like it, and I'm sure it contributed to her moving on. But also, what else had happened is I think that her stepdad came to visit us there in our little squalid place there, and he brought with him his
Kenny Rogers?
Yeah, Kenny shows up.
Okay.
And he has with him his new girlfriend, who was that girl that was on the cover of every magazine in the country for about 10 years.
Do you remember her name?
It was Mary Ann.
Mary Ann.
Yeah, I forget her last name. But she was on Hee Haw, that famous country western show on TV. They had this little troupe of women that would kind of just hang around all over the place during the show. Hee Haw was like a take on Laugh-In, which had the same thing.
Yeah.
Women just kind of laying around looking good. And Mary Ann, like they had the real country bumpkin girl, and they had these different archetypes of different women. And Mary Ann played like the aristocratic Southern belle archetype, which she really was. Just an absolutely lovely and sophisticated woman. Just as you could tell, kindness just kind of poured off of her. And she showed up with Kenny, and it was a little awkward for me, of course, but I think that had something to do with it too. I think Kenny maybe, and hopefully he did say something to Shannon about, well, it's all fine and dandy, but when you're gonna get your act together and start living your life, So it was not long after that Shannon left, and like I said, everything kind of fell apart. I had 4 dogs; they disappeared one by one, different ways, and then I got arrested in Texas, and that's where everything changed, and that's kind of where we stopped yesterday.
Was this before? Yeah, so I mean, tell that story, because I know that's a pretty crazy.
Well, that was a really huge deal.
Sequence of events, too.
Yeah, and it's an interesting story and kind of a fun story. So Ty and I were hanging out, and I could see it's like, okay, everything's, I lost all this other stuff. So I was a little angry and kind of I'm sure I wanted some change myself, something in my life to change. I didn't know, I didn't have this foggiest idea. By now I'm just like this outlaw kid. I'm 21 years old, and my ambitions, like we didn't talk about it yesterday, but when I was in high school, before I got kicked out, I wanted to be there. I had ambitions. There were three things that I wanted to maybe do. One was to produce records. I would have loved to, like George Martin, what he did with the Beatles. I would have loved to have been a record producer. I didn't play any instruments, but I thought it'd be really fun. And I wanted to go to LA, and Shannon kind of talked me out of that. She's like, no, LA's no place for a guy like you. You know, they'll eat you alive over there, and that's probably true. And the other thing I wanted to do was I was really into psychiatry and psychology, and so I might have gone into that field, or law. And law was the one I was particularly interested in, especially one that was interested in like constitutional law. So that would have been really interesting, like what would have happened if I had not been asked to leave the school and gone ahead and gotten out of school and gone on. And you know, there's a Bob Dylan song, A Simple Twist of Fate, and there's oh there, but by fortune go I, you know, that from that other song. And I've just always been fascinated by fortune and fate and the way that things happen. And on this one day at school, this dean stops me and tells me I have to decide which path I'm going to take. So I go off this way. So I'm going off this way, which was, you know, what is your ambition now? I had no ambition at that point. I was just like, well, I'm going to hang out and sell drugs. And I was never trying to make money selling drugs. The whole idea for us was really just to move drugs around to our friends. Other people were trying to make money, but it was never part of my intention was to make any more money than what I needed just to get by. So I wasn't trying to move like bunches of kilos around the country or anything, although we started doing that kind of thing. I started moving, you know, pounds of weed up to Kansas and San Francisco and different places. And we'd just drive it up there in our cars, which back in those days, maybe you'd throw it in the back seat and drive up there.
And where were you sourcing it from?
Well, I lived here in Tucson, and so I had friends that were bringing it up from Mexico. I never did. I mean, I was actually pretty, you know, I had some, like one of the rules I made was that I would never bring anything up from Mexico because I didn't want to get busted on that level, on a federal level like that, you know, and because like you got your state laws and your federal laws, and they're different. I didn't want. The other thing I knew was that because my record from when I was a kid no longer really applied because now I'm an adult now, and I always kind of knew it's like, well, you know, because it was a thing. Like you can get busted once. The first time you get busted, basically they give you probation. And I knew that. It was like, well, I can get busted once and I'll get probation. So I just kept rolling with it until, and so I ended up in Texas, which is a little bit of a funny story because I'm down here and this guy, coincident, his name was Ty also, and he calls me on the phone. He's like, oh, I can sell a bunch of pounds of weed if you can get them up here. And I'm like, you know, it's funny, there's no weed in town right now. Nobody's got any weed. And about a half an hour later, this guy pulls in my driveway coming up from Douglas, Arizona, and he's got a bunch of weed in the back of his car. So I tried to call Ty. Hey, I got the weed. I couldn't get a hold of Ty. So I said to my buddy Ty, I said, because he's hanging around, I said, let's just go over there. And he lived up in Amarillo, Texas. And so we hopped in the car and drove up to Amarillo, Texas. And we had a bunch of this stuff. And nobody had ever, you know, none of us had ever like taken it and had it lab tested or anything. But I know that this was mescaline, which is different. So, because the stuff when you take it, it would actually like make you sick, like eating peyote. And the trip was just way different than from like an LSD trip. But we were selling this stuff. And for some reason around this time, I had kind of gotten involved with some people who were dealing cocaine. And I was never like a coke guy. I was never into coke or anything, but these guys were selling cocaine, so I knew where to get a lot of cocaine, like an ounce of cocaine, which was a heck of a lot of cocaine in those days. And but anyway, so we go over to Texas, and Ty's not around. He'd gone down to San Antonio to try to get some weed or something. So we show up, and we knew a guy in Amarillo who was Ty's friend, a guy named Ray. His names keep coming back. And so we go to Ray, and we go, hey, Ray, we got all this weed and stuff, you know. So we're hanging out, me and Ty, and we were there for a couple, 2 or 3 days. And we had sold, like, because I think I had a bunch of speed, too. These weird dexedrines or something, these big white caps of tabs of speed. And I was selling them like crazy. So I'd been working in the mines here in Tucson, and I was making a fortune. I was selling speed to all these miners. Plus, I was making $8 an hour as a miner. That's a whole other story that we went right over.
Yeah, well,
the top of.
We can go back and tell the mining story after this, I guess.
But well, I worked in the mines, but
the copper mines. So.
Yeah, it was, which is a blast. It was a whole really amazing story. But so we were down to where all I had left was like maybe a little bit of weed, but I had 350 capsules of this stuff, this mescaline stuff. And Ty and I were sitting in a motel, and we were playing a game of Sorry. We're Sorry crazy. We played Sorry all the time, and Yahtzee when we were sitting around with nothing to do. We were sitting there playing Sorry like we always do, watching Bob Newhart on TV. I remember everything so clearly. And there's a knock on the door, and we're expecting somebody to come over, to get what we had left. And then we were kind of like, well, let's just go. We don't need to wait for this guy. Let's just go ahead and go. But it was like, no, we'll wait, And another one of those simple twists of fates, So knock comes on the door, and I get up off the bed and I walk over the door, and my hand is about like this far. If you got a video there, the doorknob's here, my hand is like right here, and I'm reaching for the doorknob, and the door burst open. And I remember it was just hilarious because it was like without moving a muscle, I just like went backwards about 6 feet. I just like whoop, like lifted up into the air and went back about 6 feet. I remember it was such a funny sensation. And there's like 5 of these big Texas cops, undercover cops, all standing there with their guns pointed right at me, And so that was a little scary. So they came in, and we had a joint laying there, so they immediately arrest us for the joint that's sitting there. And then they went, and they were trying to find our car, and they couldn't find the car anywhere. And they're looking all over. Well, the car was parked over at Ray's house, which is pretty funny because I guess he'd snitched us off and left town. So Ray, snitched us off, and because he had been busted for something,
right,
previously. So he snitches us off, and they show up at the motel, and it was scary, because they take us out, and they're like, well, we don't really even want to take you downtown. Maybe we'll just take you out in the desert and shoot you, And I mean, literally, they were talking that kind of stuff, and they were playing the good guy, bad guy, cop thing on us. And there was 2 of us there. It was me and Ty. And Ty and I had an arrangement where if anything like that happened, I would just say he was a hitchhiker, which I did. I just said, he's a hitchhiker. And he kept saying it, and we both just kept insisting that he was a hitchhiker. Well, they knew damn well he wasn't a hitchhiker. But they took us in, and we were actually relieved to show up at the jail instead of out in some dark canyon somewhere.
Why was it that it was your agreement that Ty was the one who you'd say was a hitchhiker or not? Why were you the one who took the fall?
Because I was always the top guy, kind of, So it was my deal. It was my scam. It was my trip, my car,
right?
My money, And
Ty was just kind of along for the ride.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like that clear cut. I mean, he had his scams and stuff going too, but
Mm-hmm.
way more often he was going along on the ride with me for something I was doing. But so they find the car finally over there parked in front of Ray's, you know, tear it apart. Like the last place they looked, you know, they finally find all this mescaline. So they took us in, and we were in there about 3 or 4 days. I had about $1,000 in my pocket, and they were making a real big deal out of that. Like, we don't make this much money in a
Mm-hmm.
month and all this kind of shit. And so we just kept insisting that Ty was a hitchhiker, and so they decided to let Ty out. And I really think the whole thing was a little bit of a scam because so they let Ty out, and then they set my bail basically at like how much money I had.
Yeah.
And so when I get out of jail, Ty immediately goes into action of getting me out of jail,
Mm-hmm.
getting bail money and stuff. So he does that, and then we get out of jail. I get out of jail too. So I'm charged, and they charge me not with mescaline but with possession of LSD. There's a real big difference because there's a different schedule, like Schedule 1, 2, 3 of the drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Mescaline was like a Schedule 3 or something, and the LSD was like a Schedule 1 or 5 or something. I don't know how it went. But
LSD was worse.
LSD was 5 to 15 years.
Yeah.
Mescaline was 3 to 5 years.
Right.
So they charged me with LSD. So, and then they let us go because we get out on bail, you know. And it was funny, it's the only time I've ever gotten a ticket. And so we get back on the road and we were hauling ass back to Tucson. And it was real funny because I had tickets to go see the Grateful Dead
Uh-huh.
in Tempe. And that was like the main thing I was worried about. The whole time I was in jail was like, man, I got tickets to go see the Grateful Dead. And I'd never seen them before.
Uh-huh.
And I was really, really excited about seeing them. That was when Terrapin Station album had just kind of come out. Really good album, you know. And I'm like, and I said, God, Ty, they can't do this live. And he's like, oh yeah, they can. you wait and see, you know. So it was just like, we got to get back to Tuesday. So I get back to Tuesday. They let us out like the morning of the concert.
Mm-hmm.
So we're like driving 80 miles an hour down the interstate trying to get back to Tucson, and I get pulled over and out about, I don't know, 40 miles west of Albuquerque. Get pulled over, and like, oh fuck, you know. And so they make us drive all the way back to Albuquerque and pay a fine, you know.
Uh-huh.
And then we got to go on, you know. So we go on. We get back to Tucson, and time to grab our stuff, get some dope, you know, and head on over to Tempe where I went and saw my first Grateful Dead concert. So this all happening. It was like 1977 by now. I remember that date. It's one of the few dates that I kind of remember. Is that 1977?
Mm-hmm.
So much happened. So like we saw the Grateful Dead and all that, but. So I'm hanging out in Tucson, and it was very, very weird because I knew they were watching me like crazy. And I think that's why they kind of made it convenient and easy for me to get it, because they thought that I was dealing cocaine. Because I had been talking to people in Texas about, do you want some cocaine?
Right.
And there were some guys that worked for the railroad, and like Union Pacific or something. And they were very much interested in some cocaine. So I was going to go back to Tucson and get like an ounce of cocaine and bring it back to these guys. And so now I'm like looking at making money as a drug dealer. I'm like, wow, I'm going to start making money here now. So it was weird because I never looked at it that way.
Yeah.
And I always kind of felt that it was kind of a karmic thing that I got busted right then. Because that was when I changed. You know, I went from just being a guy that was trying to get drugs to the people to being a guy that was like, okay, I want to make money selling cocaine, you know. And so, yeah, there's a lot I could say about it, but they were basically watching us. They had people parked out in front of the house there. I was living at my mother's house because she was living down in Patagonia, Arizona. She was like a housekeeper and a cook for some lady. And so me and Ty and my little brother all living there at her house. And the cops were definitely watching and like tapping the phone and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I had a girlfriend, and I know that they were like tapping the phone or something because like they knew about her somehow. And she was like, I think she was actually underage. She was probably 17. She was still in high school. And like she might not have been, but they went to her dad.
Mm-hmm.
Her dad had like a tire store here, and they like went over there and told him, it's like, you know, get your daughter away from this guy. We know she's not involved, but he's going down. So get her, which she didn't do. She stuck with me. And her name was Renee, and I mentioned her earlier yesterday. But so I'm getting more and more paranoid. And we used to get, like they used to talk about, you know, getting paranoid back, and that was a big thing, you know, be paranoid. Nowadays people constantly under surveillance and nobody seems to care. But we were paranoid.
Yeah.
You know, it was like they're out to get me. I really felt that way. With the buffed up charge of LSD and everything, and part of it was like they wouldn't let me out of jail unless I hired this one particular bail bonds person who made me hire this one particular lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all kind of set up. It was like their people were gonna prosecute me, and it's like they already knew how it was gonna go, kind of, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I just saw it as like this total setup. So I get back to Tucson and I'm kind of freaking out. I don't know what to do, you know. I'm just here on my own. I didn't have any support from anybody, you know, that I knew of, you know. So I decided, crazily enough, I decided to skip town. I decided, well, I'm just going to go underground. I'm going to be a fugitive. Which, you know, that was a very honorable thing to do back in the days. So I became a fugitive, and I went. It was because we didn't have anything. We didn't have any money. We don't think we had a car. We didn't have a car. We didn't have anything.
Yeah.
Just me and Ty. We had drugs, you know, and so we like hitchhike. We sneak out of the house like late at night, you know, down the alley, you know, just like you know, like I had always trained myself to be able to do, you know, how to get around things. So we get out of the house and get down to town, go out to the interstate, and freaking hitchhike up to Washington State, where I had a friend, and we had a cabin. I'm not going to tell you where it is, in case I need to go back. But I went up there and we stayed in my buddy's cabin, and had a really good time in this little town. We had a lot of drugs. We had like MDA and LSD and stuff. We always had drugs, lots of drugs. So we're up there and having a pretty good time. But for some reason, I decided I wanted to go back to Tucson.
How long were you in Washington?
I don't know, a couple of months. I know we spent a Christmas there.
Okay.
Like we spent like a winter there. And we were there for Christmas, and I remember it was all foggy and everything, and how, you know, special it was, because I'm from Arizona, so that was like a real Christmassy Christmas, you know, kind of, you know. And it was, I mean, we were young. I was like 21, maybe not even, maybe 20. And but we're hanging out in the bar, you know, and just living it up, living in this cabin, going fishing, hanging out, chasing girls. And but for some inexplicable reason, I really don't know why, I decided to come back to Tucson. So I come back to Tucson. I wish I could remember all the details because Ty didn't come with me. I remember that. Because I stopped in San Francisco and I remember I was alone. And then I had some weird adventures where I stopped in somebody let me off at Golden Gate Park, and I was walking around. I run into that. I don't know his name. He's a guru that has all these Rolls Royces.
Osho.
Osho, yeah, he was like.
God, I remember the name of his squad. It starts with an R.
Well, they were having this big, huge parade, and all these guys with saffron robes and bald heads, and they were rolling these big, huge carts that they had down the road in Golden Gate Park, and then here he comes in his Rolls Royces. And I remember like, well, what's this all about? And so I walk up to the lead Rolls Royce, and I like knock on the window. I knock on the window.
Yeah. And
he rolls his window down, and like there he is. Now he's looking at me, and I'm looking at him. A lot like the time I met Bob Dylan. And I remember just kind of looking at him and like shaking my head, like, no, this, whatever it is you're doing here, this ain't it, Like, no, that was it. That was our conversation, is me, him looking at me and me going like this, and then I left, So I get back to
Tucson. What didn't you like about Osho?
I didn't like anything about him. I thought it was all just a big, Osho circus, and he was taking money from people and not really, because I was pretty much into the whole. I was into this kind of like rough God, I love this great Van Morrison has a great rough God goes riding, and that was my God was like in Jesus, and then we were like it was like Jesus was a cowboy or something, and so I wasn't into all this show and this expense and Rolls Royces. To me, that was the last thing in the world you needed for spiritual growth and stuff, so I wasn't into it, but so I get back here to Tucson, and then Ty shows up too a little bit later. I said, I don't know why I came by myself, and then he came back later, but I'm down here in Tucson now, and I'm hanging out again, and I'm getting really, really paranoid, and I decided that I was going to go up into the mountain here, this Catalina mountain, and hide out up in the mountain. And it's when it gets really ridiculous, because I had like $100 that I'd gotten for Christmas present from my dad or something. I don't know what it was.
How did your dad know where you were?
Nobody knew where I was.
How'd you get the $100 from him?
I don't know. But I had like 100. I'm not sure that's where it came from.
Yeah.
But I had like $100, which was special. Like,
yeah.
I didn't usually have $100. So I had $100, and Ty and I went down to the food co-op. We bought all these bags of rice and beans and lentils and stuff like that. And then we took it all up into the mountains.
Yeah.
A beautiful place up in the mountains to hide out. And the idea is that we were going to like live up there and just, I don't know what our idea was. I was just going to live up in the mountain and be an outlaw. And I, foolishly, of course, I swiped my mom's pistol on the way out the door. So I had her pistol with me. And I had my little brother drive us up to this place and let us off. So he was the only one who knew where we were. And I was tough with my brother. I was like, if you tell anybody where I am, I'll kill you, kind of a thing. And because
he's like, what, 15?
If that, he must have been 16, because, he was at least 16, I think, because he was driving. And so he drops us off, and I was going, don't tell anybody. And we went up there, and we're up there for a couple weeks. And it was funny, because, this Tucson doesn't usually rain, but it was like the whole time we were up there, it was like raining. So we were really struggling with the rain, me and Ty. We tried to keep our food dry. We didn't have anything. We didn't have tents. We didn't have anything. We had some plastic bags and an old pot to cook in or something. And all the wood's getting wet and everything. And we have no idea what the hell we're doing. But we're up there. And then Ty and I decide, we get an idea that, this is where it gets really silly, where we're going to get horses. and ride our horses down into Mexico. And disappear down into Mexico and live like these wandering sage guys, you know, wandering wise men. And so Todd's like, okay, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go to Phoenix, get a job as a dishwasher so I can buy horses. And he leaves.
Uh-huh.
So I'm up there in the mountain now just by myself with my beans I can't cook and my pistol and, you know, nothing to do, nowhere to go, nobody to talk to. And I'm up there, you know. I don't know how long I'd been up there, but it was pretty miserable. And I didn't know if Ty was actually going to come back, you know, ever or what. You know, I kind of figured he would because we were, you know, we were like blood brothers. You know, we were like best friend, blood brother type guys, and so I figured he would. And but I didn't know when, you know, or anything. And but it was funny because I'm up there, like I got a pistol, and I'm going, what am I doing up here? You know, what are you gonna shoot somebody over LSD? You know, that's not what that was all about. Just going around killing people. What did you learn from all those LSD? Is that what you learned from taking LSD? Was that you kill people? You know, and I was like, this is all wrong. What I'm doing is wrong, and I need to believe in something besides just like survival of the fittest kind of thing. And it was also real funny because the Grateful Dead were really big in my life right then. And there was that song "Box of Rain." It just kept going through my head over and over and over again. Like I said, it had been raining, so there was that. But there was like this line in that song, it's like walk through any wind, you know, walk through any doorway, feel your way like the day before. And I really felt that Jerry Garcia was sending me a message. You know, we were really high, man. So, you know, you get messages from people like Jerry Garcia while you're hiding out up in the mountains as an outlaw. So I'm getting this message from Jerry Garcia that says, you know, you're going to be okay. You know, you're going to walk through this doorway. And so I decided, without anybody's help except for Jerry's, that I was going to go turn myself in. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of this. I don't want to kill anybody over LSD, you know. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn myself in. And it was so bizarre. And this is one of those things that's always made me kind of believe in magic, you know. This is such a magical moment. So I walked out of where I am, which is a long hike, you know. It was like 2 hours or something to walk from there down to where the trailhead was. Nobody knew where I was except for my little brother. So I'm walking down the trailhead, and I notice that there's a car coming up the road. And the car's going to get to the trailhead right about the same time I do. So I get to the trailhead, the car gets to the trailhead, and it's my mother. She had convinced Duke to tell her where I was. Because the bail bonds people and everything who were like, we're going to find this guy, you know?
Yeah.
So they had been calling her, calling my dad, calling all these people trying to figure out what happened to me. Because I just fell off the earth, you know? And they're all like, where is he, you know? So there's my mom right there, you know, right when I hit the trailhead, there she was. And she picks me up, drives me back in town, didn't really talk about it much, you know, it was just kind of like, here I go, defeated once again, you know. And like that night or the next day, I'm on a plane to Amarillo because I think I'd already missed my court date, or my court date was like the next day or something.
Yeah.
And so, and then my dad, who I thought really just was pretty much out of the picture by then, actually shows up at the courtroom. My mom wasn't there. I like flew into Puerto Rico. Flew into Amarillo, And then he flew in from Puerto Rico and met me there and went to court with me. And the judge, of course, hated me and said something about Art Linkletter's daughter. They always did.
About what?
Art Linkletter's daughter.
Who's Arch Linkletter?
She's the girl that jumped out of the window, remember?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, Straight America was obsessed
Uh-huh.
with Art Linkletter's daughter jumping out of the window
Okay.
on LSD. So, and I'm standing there listening to this crap and going, okay, don't worry about Art Linkletter's daughter. She's gone. But it's like, we don't want people like you,
Uh-huh.
who are causing our daughters to jump out of windows.
Uh-huh.
And I'm going, she jumped out of a window because her dad probably drove her crazy, or
Yeah.
something. And so, quite miraculously, I get convicted, guilty, but they give me instead of sending me to prison, which I could have done 15 years, to Lubbock prison, which would not have been fun at all. Skinny little, hippie boy,
Uh-huh.
getting sent off to Lubbock prison. And, but, I was ready to face it,
Yeah.
but instead they gave me this, there was no plea deal or anything that I made. I think my dad had talked to them.
That's what I'm wondering, if your dad had kind of...
Yeah, he
worked something.
interceded, and,
Yeah.
he's just a bit, handsome playboy businessman.
Yeah.
So he knew how to handle that stuff. And so I get like a 3-year suspended sentence. So I'm convicted, I'm guilty,
Uh-huh.
and it wasn't parole,
It's probation, yeah.
it was different because like if you mess up, they can just pick you up off the street.
Yeah.
They don't have to find anything wrong. They can just change their mind basically and send you on to prison. So I had this 3-year suspended sentence and a fine of a couple $1,000 I had to pay. And I had to go back to Tucson. So I didn't want to stay in Texas, and so go back to Tucson, and it was like, okay, you got 10 days to meet, because I was going to have a parole officer
Mm-hmm.
to oversee my thing. So it said, you got 10 days to go see this guy. So I go in, after, probably right away, I go in. And I go walking in there, and there's Nick Martinez sitting there behind the desk. And Nick Martinez was one of my counselors when I was out at the place.
At the Boys Ranch.
No, the place right before the Boys Ranch.
Okay.
Where I picked up cigarette butts.
Yeah.
So there's Nick Martinez sitting there, and he looks at me and goes, I figured I'd see you again.
Uh-huh.
First thing he says. So I'm like, because I'm nobody's fool, I mean,
Yeah.
like, it's like, you asshole, why do you have to say shit like that to me,
Yeah.
It's like, I hear you, I know where you're coming from,
Yeah.
You're trying to make me think you're smart, but I know I'm way smarter than you are, Nick, So that was my attitude in those days.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm smarter than all of you people, and I'm just playing your game, and ultimately I'm going to beat you in your own game, even
Yeah.
though you do all this stuff to me. I'm going to end up winning, And so he's like, okay, you got to get a job and all this kind of stuff, And so I go out and get a job. I got a job working at bottling Coke, like a soft drink bottling company. Then I get a job out at a place that made rubber hoses for the Air Force, big, huge,
Mhm.
rubber hoses for refueling planes.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost lost one of my hands working there. Got my sleeve got caught in one of the rollers, and I'm like,
shit.
"Ah,"
Yeah.
And it was just absolutely horrible, miserable. There was nobody there to be friends with. Right next door to us, there was Hughes. Like, we actually shared a building. They're like making missiles there, so I'm like watching them, pack out these, plats full of missiles coming out while I'm over there making rubber hoses,
Mm-hmm.
And I had bought an old motorcycle from somebody, from Bill Cundiff, probably for $50 or something, So it was
Mhm.
really cool old BSA motorcycle. that was my only joy in life. So I had this old motorcycle. I had a cool old motorcycle, but I didn't have a girlfriend. I didn't have anything. Ty's gone, and I'm just there, and I'm on.
Ty just disappeared.
I don't know. So, yeah, I mean, I went
Yeah.
to, he didn't know. He probably went back to Florida or something. So I'm there, blah, blah, blah. And a friend of mine, it was actually my buddy Corey Whitkoff's older brother, because Corey's dead now, and Mark, who I had taken drugs up to where he lived in Moab, Utah.
Mm-hmm.
I'd gone up there with kilos, so I'd been there like once or twice. And he lived up there, and he was doing river guiding on the Colorado River.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Why don't you see if you can move up here?" And so I went to my parole officer, and I knew, it's like because he was a real jock.
Yeah.
So I knew it's like, oh, he'll go for this.
Yeah.
I'm going to go in, and I'm going to say, listen, because it was true too. Because it was like, if you get caught, if we see you hanging out with your old friends,
Yeah.
or I didn't know anybody that wasn't a drug dealer, So it was like I either completely stayed alone, or it was just the odds of me making it without going back to jail were pretty damn slim. So I go to Nick, and I just kind of knew he'd go for it, and I said, listen, I want to move up to this little Mormon town. It kind of goes back to my Bill Bixby story, wanting to be like my Eddie's father that I told in jail in the courthouse that time. Same story basically. So I want to move up to Moab and live in this little quiet little Mormon town. I'm gonna be a river runner. I'm gonna get my life together, and I'll be a jock like you, Nick. I'm gonna be just like you next time you see me. And he was like, yeah, okay. He says, you can go up there. I'll give you like a week. Go up there, and if you can find a job and a place to live, I'll let you move up there. Just had to transfer my parole. So I go up there. Right away, I find like 3 jobs, 3 places to live. Everything's just going like perfect. So I come back. I said, well, I'm going to move to Moab. So I had gotten a job working for Lynn Ottinger, who was a real character.
I think now's actually, let's take a pause, because I think that is kind of starts the next big period of your life.
It does, and that's how I got there, was
Yeah.
this whole adventure of being an outlaw, being a fugitive, and trying to play the system.
So let's take a pause there, and then keep going in a moment with the second big part of your life. Okay. So before we get to Moab, I do want to kind of back up a little bit and fill in some of the gaps here, and talk a little bit about what's going on with your family, because I know that you're increasingly losing touch with your family, but I do think that kind of the parallel paths that you and your siblings all took are important to understand a little bit in understanding you. And then I also want to talk about the copper mine a little bit, because I guess now that I guess it wasn't really that big of a deal, but for me as like a little kid, that was like a story you tell me a lot, because I guess it was like one of your more age-appropriate stories for little kids or something. Well, so the fact that you had like worked in a copper mine was like really cool, as something that's always really stood out to me. So I'd like to talk about it a little bit, just because it's something that I think about a lot when I think about you.
Well, it was fascinating, but the copper mine. So this was. I knew Shannon, was wanting to see something happen.
Yeah.
She was still living with me, but it was towards the very end of her living with me. And my sister's husband was like the guy that hires people up at San Manuel Mine, which was about 50 miles north of Tucson. And working at the San Manuel Mine was a big deal. The mines there were like just a couple different big time, ways of being employed here in Arizona. The mines were one of them. The others had something to do with farming or Davis Monthan or something. But the copper mines, like could almost shut the, like if the people went on strike or
Yeah.
if the mine shut down for some reason, it would really mess with the local economy. It was a big deal on the economy here. And they actually paid, like when I got hired on, a starting wage was like $8.50 an hour,
Yeah.
which was huge in those days. I think minimum wage was probably $2 or something, you know, if that. And so I was trying to, you know, I mean, I would try to have like a normal life when I, you know, it's so hard to look back on it because there was a part of me that never wanted any of this, you know,
Mm-hmm.
this whole outlaw, Scotty. Like I said, I wanted to go to school. I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a psychiatrist. I wanted to produce records. I wanted to have nice girlfriends. I wanted to have things. I was never materialistic to speak of, but I just wanted to be part of society sometimes.
Yeah.
And I wasn't a derelict by any means. I was way out there. I was eating a lot of psychedelic drugs, which gave me this whole other psychedelic perspective, but that wasn't really, there's some very famous people who did that and went on to become very successful. So, you know, that wasn't all that strange of a thing to do, but for me it was a little different 'cause I had no support. Those other people had support systems behind them and stuff. Whereas I didn't. I was just some kid out there winging it, you know. And but anyway, I got a job out the mines, which I loved. The mine was really a fun place to work, and I wasn't there. I was only there for a couple of months, but I really loved it. My job was to break rocks with a 16-pound sledgehammer all day. A 16 pounds, it's like a thing about yay big. A small loaf of bread, not that big, you know, and heavy. The first day or, you know, first week of work, you barely pick the thing up off the ground. And you'd have to break rocks. They had a grate
Mm-hmm.
made out of railroad tie, not ties, but track.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a steel railroad track, and it went about 3.5, maybe 4 feet across a hole in the ground. And the hole went down, there were trains, actual little trains underneath the ground below you. And on either side, because you're in this tunnel, a concrete tunnel that they'd gone in and drilled and blasted and dug, and they dug these tunnels, and then they would create like a concrete thing around them. So you weren't just like, wasn't just raw rock, there was like concrete
Mm-hmm.
with big holes in the concrete, like, you know, for they were there for a reason. And then they would blast the rock. They'd stick dynamite in that hole there, blast it with dynamite, and then the rocks would come down and land on the grate. And our job was, they called it chute tappers, to tap the rocks through the chute. So if it didn't go through the chute, our job was to break the rocks with a sledgehammer and get them to go through the chute. And it didn't matter what you did. If you could get it through the chute, you got it through the chute. So it could be, you know, skinny, but huge otherwise. If you could get it through the chute, it was okay. And if you couldn't, then you had to stand there and break it. And it was great fun breaking rocks. There was a real art to it, because you would like set up, you'd hit it, and then you'd start setting these vibrations. It'd be like bam, 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 bam. And you'd learn how to do it. You could feel it. You could feel the vibration. The big granite rocks. Bam, bam. And then the rocks would practically explode. At some point you'd hit it and they'd just go and just break into all these little pieces. And then they'd go down the chute. And it was an extremely dangerous job. We had a hook, it's like a shepherd hook kind of thing. And we'd use that to pull the rocks and manipulate them to get them to where they'd go down through the chute. And it was really easy to fall through the chute, but we always wore a strap connected to a cable above us, and you wore that strap, you know, because it was dangerous. and it was really weird place. There's no air down there, none at all. And so the only air that there was piped into you. So we all carried these little things called bazookas, and it was a little thing you'd screw it into the pipe up above, and it would blow oxygen down on you. And then there was oxygen out in the main areas and stuff, and they controlled that with chambers and doors and fans and stuff. There was this whole almost like a city down there. These trains going around, and an elevator that held 100 men, 2-story elevator. There'd be 50 men below and 50 men on top. And you'd walk in, and the first guy would walk in and go to the far corner here and stand there like this. The next guy would come in behind him, and behind you'd fill up that row, and they'd come in, then the next row. 50 men all standing, looking forward, and up both, fill the bottom, then fill the top one. And then they drop that thing. It was amazing when they dropped. It'd be like, and then when they hit like where they were going, it would like bounce, big old cable on that thing, and so that was real fun. And then we'd get off the elevator. It was really a funny job. And then we'd have to ride another train to get to where we were going. After that, and then sometimes 2 trains, And then we'd have to walk, so it'd take us an hour or more sometimes to get to where we were actually going to go do the work, to go to break rocks,
Yeah.
And I was a shoot down there with these other guys that were miners, and I wasn't a miner; they were miners. A miner was one of the guys that builds the tunnels. Those were miners. They'd come in and they'd drill these holes, and so they were like the elite guys. I was a shoot tapper, and like there were a couple guys that died in the short time I was working there. And one day I came real close to getting killed. They put me into a tunnel that started running like pure mud. It was just running like a river, and so like when it filled up where the trains were, right? So it's running ore, and they're loving it because they're getting all this ore, the dirt. They want to keep that thing flowing. It's like, yeah, we're filling up trains, And I'm in there for some reason. They sent me in there, and they were like, well, you can't wear a strap because we might have to pull you out. And I'm like such a dumb idiot. I'm like, okay, but back in those days, I had no fear of anything really, and so I just was too stupid to have fear. So I'm like, okay, I'll do it, So I'm in there because they wanted me in there in case a big boulder came down and stuck up the flow, and I'm supposed to, get the boulder out so to keep. But it's like what could have happened, and it did happen where the stuff was coming up so fast it would fill up the train, and then it would fill up the shaft all the way up to the grate, and then start filling up the tunnel I was in. So I'm like, the whole tunnel could have just filled up with mud, and I would have been in there, and they're like going to pull me out? Like, sure, no way, You'd have to have a train to pull me out, and by the time you pulled me out, I'd be dead, ripped to pieces. So, stuff like that, but it was fun, But,
That's a.
I was doing good. I remember one day I got recommended, like the big boss guy was like, man, you really pulling. I was pulling in like 13 carloads of ore a day and stuff, and they were really liking me, and I knew I'm like one of the only white guys. Everybody in there's Mexican, and everybody just assumed, that I'd be going into management sometime soon, which I didn't want to do. I know my first day there, this old Mexican guy, old man, he comes up and he says, I've been here like forever, and I'm still a shoot tapper. And he said, they tried to move me up into management, and I wouldn't do it. He says, if you're smart, just stay a shoot tapper. Don't move up, because then you have nothing but trouble once you move up. So I was like already like, I don't want to move up, I'll just be a shoot tapper. But anyway, I ended up leaving that job Things at home started getting, Shannon
Mm-hmm.
was starting to run around with other guys and stuff real bad. And that was bothering me a lot. And I don't know. I just didn't want to work there anymore for some reason. I
Mhm.
felt like I had plenty of money or something. So I quit.
Mm-hmm.
And then yeah, life went on, and then all this other stuff happened, and then I moved up to Moab.
And what's going on with Betty Dell and Carrie Starr at this time?
Well, they've all just kind of given up on me, sort
Yeah.
of. You know, they like, oh, my brother's an outlaw. You know,
Yeah.
and you know, everybody, my dad, my mother, my sisters. You know, Duke probably was kind of idolizing me in a way, some weird way. You know, but yeah, I didn't really have any support from the family or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I moved to Moab, I mean, I probably didn't even say anything to anybody. I probably just moved to Moab, you know.
And okay, and then yeah, so let's start that part of the story then.
Well, Moab was.
What happens when you show up at Moab and
Well, I get a job with this guy, Lynn Ottinger. He's like the first guy I talked to.
yeah.
And he had a little rock shop there. And I go in, I go, hey, I make jewelry, you know. You want me to sit in the window and make jewelry or something, you know? Something, can we do, I buy some rocks from you or
Wait,
sign some rocks or something.
Have you learned how to make jewelry at this point?
Yeah, I learned right before I left Tucson.
Oh, okay.
Because Shannon started going to Pima College.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, well, I'll take a couple courses. And so I like showed up for like one class.
Okay.
My jewelry class. And then she had her Don Graham's one of his best buddies was a guy named Don Lore. And Shannon took me over to the house one day, and Don Lore spent the whole afternoon showed me how to cut and polish rocks. So I had one lesson from Don Lore, and I had one lesson from Pima College on the silversmithing. So I knew how to make jewelry, you know. And so yeah, I get up to Moab. I was like, oh, you know, I'll make jewelry for you, or I don't know what it was. I've just been trying to talk rocks with him or something, you know. But anyway, he offered me a job. He had a bunch of rocks, and he's like, here, turn these into jewelry. So I sat there in the window and made jewelry.
Talk about Lynn Ottinger a little bit more, because he's such a character.
Well, Lynn's still alive.
Is he?
I think so, just barely. He's like 100 years old now.
Holy shit. I mean, I met his son, and his son's ancient.
Yeah, Sonny. Yeah. And so Lynn was a real, he was like he was like a snake, you know. He just had that whole like hissy kind of, he was super smart. He was a farm boy from Tennessee. And he really knew how to do just about anything. He'd figure it out. Like he'd figure out a way to make things easier, you know. And he had all these little tricks, or if he was doing mechanic work or working on rocks or making jewelry or whatever, he had all these little tricks. And but he was a really good photographer. He was a dinosaur hunter. He has dinosaurs named after him. He was also, up in Moab at the time was just this dinky little town. Nobody knew anything about it. I'd never really heard of Moab except I'd been up there selling pot. But now Moab's a big deal. You know, Hollywood movie stars live there now. But it was just this dumpy little town. And I go up there and I started working for Lynn. And Lynn also did tours. He would do these slideshows at night. He was like a carnival barker. He'd stand out on the sidewalk at night, and tourists, there weren't very many of them, but there were enough. They'd be out walking around after dinner, and he'd like, come on in and see the free slideshow. And he had flyers all over town. Free slideshow, free slideshow. Get a free piece of dinosaur bone with this card, you know. And he'd have this little dinosaur scrap bone he'd give to the people, you know. But he'd get people in there and they'd do this slideshow. And the slideshow basically was cleverly disguised as a ad for his tours. He'd show pictures of stuff that you would see if you went on his tour, plus a bunch of other really beautiful stuff. And it was a really good slideshow. And Lynn's a total goof, and so he's over there, he's cracking jokes the whole time, and just cutting up, crazy Tennessee, like something out of Hee-Haw or something. But he had a real dark side, Lynn did. He was really into going around the desert, and like he'd just steal anything that that somebody didn't have their hands on. He'd steal it and bring it home. And he had this huge museum of stuff that he had stolen and brought home.
Well, and he's a great. I mean, because he had back then. Did he have the beard down to his gut yet? No, okay. Because I've seen pictures of him where he just looks like a total wizard. Yeah.
Well, he decided he wanted to look like the Unabomber, I think. But yeah, he was a real rat. He hated the government, and he did. You expect him to pull a two-headed snake out of his back pocket or something, And he was really into. He had this thing like Barnum and Bailey, like the people are all suckers.
Yeah.
He really insulted when they weren't there, and even when they were there, sometimes he really would insult the intelligence of everybody around him,
Yeah.
And he treated the tourists kind of, but on the other hand, he was really kind. He's the kind of person, he would help anybody. If he drove by you on the side of the road, he'd stop and get you back on the road. And he could fix anything. And he had a whole fleet of Volkswagen buses. And they were the old Volkswagen buses with canvas tops that rolled back and had like 20-something windows they had windows along the side. And those Volkswagen buses are worth like $100,000 each now. And he probably had 15 of them. Probably still does. And so we'd use those. We'd go out and drive around out in the desert in these Volkswagen buses. Because you didn't really need four-wheel drive where we went. You just needed really, really good clearance. And he was very particular about how you drove his buses. He treated them like he babied these buses. They were all old when we were driving them. They were already old. And I really wanted to do a tourist, but I was making jewelry, Well, the guy in front of me one day falls off the cliff. The guy doing tours. And it was this real heavy thing where it's like he just fell off the cliff. And a place called Poison Point, which is where Thelma and Louise famously drove their car off the cliff. Same spot, exact same spot. And one day he was out there doing tours, and he was supposed to walk down to this rock, and you sit on the rock and hang your feet over the edge, and people can take a picture of you, and your feet are like hanging, like they can see the river 1,500 feet down. Amazing photo when you get it. But it was kind of dangerous to walk down there and sit on that rock, but it was part of what we did. But there was gravel there. It was slippery. You had to be careful. So anyway, this guy fell off right there. And for some reason, the tourists didn't see him fall. They didn't know what happened. They were like, he was just gone. Like, he didn't scream or anything. He was just gone. And finally, maybe he fell off the cliff, So the tourists ended up driving themselves, which is kind of, nobody knew how to shift gears. So they drove in first gear all the way back to which of course Lynn was probably as upset about that as losing his driver, But the next day Lynn got a boat and went down and found this guy's body and brought it back. And well, anyway, so then I got hired. To do these tours. And I'd go down and sit on the rock, And I loved doing it. I had a whole little spiel, because Lynn had kind of trained us. Had gone out with him a couple times, so we knew what things were, or we were supposed to. At first, I didn't know anything, but you learn, and all the different formations, what they're all made of, and whatever history you can pick up on, and all that kind of stuff.
Well, and you're driving around in Canyonlands National Park, right?
Canyonlands National Park, yeah. And it was so beautiful. you didn't really need to know anything or anything because
Yeah.
just being there. And I said, this is back when nobody was there. So you'd be out there and no one else would be around. It would just be you and your tourists. And it really had like, people really felt like they were out someplace special, which they were. And then we had this whole thing, and then Lynn ended up getting in a big fight with James Webb, who was running the Department of Interior at the time, because they came in and started trying to close down because Lynn had started doing the tours before it was a park. And so he was the one that actually built some of the roads that people were using out there. But he had these secret little roads that Lynn would take in the bus, and he taught us where they all were. And there were these little secret roads where you could drive up and get up on top of some hill, and there'd be something special there. There'd be some petroglyphs, or there'd be like this, usually like a really great place to take a photo. Because the tours were kind of geared around taking great photos. And a lot of the customers that went with us were professional photographers. Because back in those, there weren't really that many regular tourists. Most of the people that went with us were, travelers. They had some idea of getting out. They weren't like, where am I? We had some of those people too, but so it was really a lot of fun. I did that for a couple of years, and then Lynn, he gave me a house to live in, so I lived in the house, and stuff started happening. I started making friends. There was a bar there where we all hung out, called the Pauper Place, and so it was a really wonderful life. You knew everybody, from the judge to the sheriff to the town drunk. You knew everybody knew everybody. Everybody called you by name. The Mormons didn't bother us at all, and we didn't seem to bother them. And we just lived our lives there. Most of the other people that I knew, they were river runners. That's what most of the kids did. So those of us who did Jeep tours, we were kind of like a little bit different. We were like more like the intellectuals,
Sure.
Of the tour business. The river runners were like there to pick up chicks with their, bronze, their bronze skin and their
All right.
long blonde hair, and their muscles. So yeah, I did tours, and then I became a regular at the Pauper Place. Everybody was, and eventually I got a job as a bartender at the Pauper Place, and I quit working for Lynn because he was.
Okay. Do you need to take a break?
I'll be right. He was hard to get along with. It was real easy to make him angry or something. One of my friends who came over to the house where I was staying, Lynn had a bunch of old antiques stashed over there, and there was a table, it's an antique table, beautiful table, and this friend of mine had burnt the table just on the top. Lynn got really upset about it, and that was like I moved out of his house and quit working for him, and then I worked at the Pauper Place, and then I just kind of quit working at all, But
well, yeah. So talk a little bit about who was around. Who were you hanging out with? Who were your friends?
Well, I had a lot of friends that had come up.
Yeah.
Captain Crud.
So yeah, who's Captain Crud?
Well, Captain Crud was a good friend of mine from Tucson. I knew him back when I was going to Fenster. Because we all hung out at this park down in Tucson.
Did he go to Fenster?
No, he went to Catalina, and so I got to know him. So he came up.
Why is his name Captain Crud?
And Ty gave him. I don't know, just fit him really good.
Okay.
Captain Crud, and he was a cruddy guy. He was funny. Captain was a real hoot. He was really funny, and he was totally inhibited. Uninhibited. He just he wasn't afraid. It was him, Fernie,
Never heard of Fernie.
Mark Marksberry.
Oh, that's Mark
Marksberry. We
Okay.
called him Fernie
Okay.
because he was like a piece of furniture. And Fernie was an amazing human. He was like an all-star basketball player in
Oh,
high
really?
school and stuff. And then he became a hippie, and then I'm sure all the Mormons all hated us for losing their all-star basketball player.
Was he from Moab?
Yeah, he lived
Yeah.
in Moab, and his dad worked in the mines and stuff, and so he kind of became our friend. And Tony, my friend Tony,
Uh-huh.
who I had some adventures with him too, he came up for a while. But, there were a couple other people too. That happened to me though when I would move places. Other people would show up, and then I'm up there, and I met Becky
Uh-huh.
then, because I had this house that Lynn had given me to live in, and so Becky moved into my house, and Niles,
Mm-hmm.
and Becky. It was weird because Becky was like going through guys like candy, and she was going with Fernie
Uh-huh.
Marksberry, and then she started going with
Oh.
Niles, and then she moved into my house and started
Yeah.
going with me.
Well, let's slow down here for a moment and talk more about Becky, because she's going to become kind of a main character here.
Well,
Um,
yeah.
So how do you meet Becky? Where does she come from? And
Well, she was like a lot of the other kids my age that
Yeah.
were in Moab. They just showed up there for some reason or
Yeah.
another. There were like a lot, we all were. We were like black sheep.
yeah,
All these black sheep hippie kids who had showed up in Moab and dug it and found some way to get by there. Becky was a waitress, of course,
mm-hmm.
and she moved into my house.
You don't remember? I mean, do you remember how you met or what?
I
She
met
was.
her at the
What was she like? Kind of. You
Well, I
know?
met her at the Pauper place.
Yeah.
Probably she's just one of the gals, like if you were to watch an old western and
Yeah.
Matt Dillon would be there, and what was her name, Kate, or somebody. There we actually had a gal named Kate who played a big role and everything up there, but she was like a bar queen, a honky tonk
Mm-hmm.
girl, and she was just a hard drinking, gal, liked men. And like I said, she was actually, and then before Mark, there was another guy named Brad Timpson, who she kind of moved there with Brad Timpson.
Mm-hmm.
Brad Timpson was a river runner, but for some reason she left Brad Timpson, and then she went with Marksberry, and then Niles, and then me, and it was all weird because we never should have gotten together. It just we were like living in this house together, and one day we ended up climbing into bed,
Mm-hmm.
We never should have done that. We should have just stayed friends. It's really a shame that we had that kind of sexual revolution in a way, because it was just like, well, let's all have sex, and once you do that, it changes everything in a relationship. And so now it becomes like, well, me and you were kind of like an item somewhat almost. And I know she kind of tried to avoid having that kind of a one-on-one relationship with me. And it was probably my fault, more than hers, that we did.
Mm-hmm.
Because then she left my house and moved out to Castle Valley, and for some reason I ended up moving out to Castle Valley with her.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like living in her house now in Castle Valley. But so we were kind of on and off, Becky and I, more on than off, and eventually we spent about 3 years together, and we were having some troubles because Becky was running around, and I wasn't real firmly committed to Becky either.
Mm-hmm.
Although I didn't really run around, I just wasn't really a run around guy so much. I'd flirt around, but I didn't really take things much further than that. And then, so anyway, she ends up falling for Ty at some point.
Well, slow down. You're telling the story real fast here.
Well, there's so much I could say, but it'd take all day.
I know. It's hard to kind of. Well, when does Ty show back up?
Ty was kind of always there. He came up to Moab and
Right when he moved there. So
pretty much.
How did he even know that you moved there? I mean,
well, because he was my best friend.
Okay, he's figured it out.
Yeah, he came. The first time
Yeah.
I went to Moab, he was with me.
Okay.
You know, and I remember him and I, we want to go up there to sell weed.
Yeah.
And we're going up there and we're like, God, this is a gorgeous place.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to live here, you know, but we're like, we can't live here. This is Mormon country, you know.
Yeah.
And, so I ended up moving up there, and then shortly after that he arrived. And then these other guys, Captain Crud and Tony, and I forget, there were a few people that showed up. And, so it was like my scene again. Once again, it was like my scene.
Yeah.
And I had a job, you know.
Yeah.
Captain Crud didn't have a job. Ty didn't have a job. Becky had a job. So we just lived up there, and there were all these guys that were river runners. And,
Yeah.
but we just had a life, and eventually, you know, there's things I could put in, like, you know, I went and lived in Boulder, Utah. I got a job running a ranch one summer out in Boulder. I'd just been out driving around there, and my VW broke down, and I got a job.
Yeah.
You know, taking care of a ranch, doing irrigation on a ranch. So that was my first ranch job, was there in Boulder, which was an amazing place to live. And there again in Boulder, all these people,
Utah, not Colorado.
and all these people from Utah, from Moab, ended up moving out to Boulder. From Joe Costanza and Mama Linda, and Duke shows up from Virginia, and you know, we had a whole scene going out there, and you know, a bunch of hippies like living this kind of communal life. And it was great. We had an open fire that we cooked over, and you know, we had an outhouse that we, you know, was very you know, rustic kind of living, but we loved it. We lived well. We were all really healthy.
Yeah.
And eating like a lot of natural, like Becky'd go out and pick natural, you know, things like lamb's quarter and stuff like that. And we were like eating that kind of stuff all the time, like getting real healthy. And we just had a wonderful time up there. Becky and Mitch started, because Ty was my best friend.
Yeah.
So it was like a threesome all the time anyway. So Ty and Becky, of course, they actually hit it off really well. In some ways, they were kind of more suited as a couple than me and Becky, in a way. And eventually that's what ended up happening. I was like out of town. I'd gone to Virginia to help my mother with something.
So you slow down the story here a little bit.
Well, my mom, after I moved to Moab,
Yeah.
my mom and my little brother moved back to Virginia
Yeah.
to take care of her mother, which I didn't have anything to do with it. They dropped by and said hi on their way,
Yeah.
and then they went. So anyway, I went back there to help her with something. While I'm gone, Becky and Ty hook up, and I come back, you know, and it was a big scene because, you know, we're all like really high all the time on acid, and nobody really knew what to do. And we all wanted to do the right thing, but nobody really knew what the right thing was, you know. And so Becky and I would, you know, I'd be like, what are you doing hanging out with Mitch? He's a fucking junkie, you know. And he's like my friend, but he's a junkie. I mean, you're going to, you know, pick him over me, you know. And she'd be like, yeah, I'm nuts. What am I doing that for, you know? And so we go back and forth. But the whole time, Ty and I never quit being friends. There was just this thing going on, and then eventually she came back. She said, let's get married. So Becky and I get married. And it was really funny because it was a huge deal in Moab. Okay, everybody in town came to this wedding. Huge wedding. And, you know, we had a good time. But we were married like 6 months. And 6 months later we got divorced because she kept going back to Ty and other guys as well, you know. So I dodged that bullet and got a divorce from Becky and all that. And I didn't want to, you know, I was trying real hard to keep the thing going. I was trying to be which was foolish. I mean, if knowing what I know now, I'd be like, oh, okay, good luck and good riddance, you know. but I was trying to hold it together. You know, I fancied myself being in love with Becky.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back on it now, I guess I was, you know, in some
Well,
kind of way, but
I want to kind of I want to get into a little bit more what's going on with Becky, and because I mean, I guess this is one thing that I'll insert my own perspective here, which is that later on when I'm born, to this day, she's Aunt Becky to me,
Right.
you know, and Becky's always been a part of my life and
Yeah.
and my sister's lives, and you're still friends with Becky,
right,
and I mean, she really is she's one of first of all, she's one of the few people in that friend group who is alive,
right,
who survived, you know. And then she's also, I mean, just like a creative genius, and so like I don't know. I want you to talk a little bit more about what the connection there was beyond
between me and Becky.
just who Becky. I mean, not necessarily romantically or whatever. Just who Becky was as a person, kind of, you know.
Well, like I said, she
Yeah.
was kind of this very independent, very, you know, good looking back in those days. She was a very good looking woman, you know. All the guys wanted to be with her, you know. Not just me, you know. I mean, everybody did, but I was with her, and you know, so that was kind of cool for me, you know. And but like I said, we should have just, like, there was an old show, Gunsmoke, you know, and there was a Matt Dillon, and he had this the gal that worked at the bar, and I think her name was Kate, and Becky was kind of like that, you know. She was like good friends to the marshal, sort of a thing, and occasionally they would sleep together, you know, although they didn't show you that on the TV series, but you kind of assumed that maybe that's what was going on, and that's how it should have stayed with me and Becky. If we were going to have any kind of relationship, we should never have taken it past that. But unfortunately, we got involved in this whole thing of whose girl are you? And it wasn't just me, you know, because she's the one that asked me to marry her. And I was like, okay. And I knew when she did, I was like, I shouldn't do this. It was going back to me not being able to say no to people, what we talked about yesterday. And she said, well, you want to get married? And I knew that was a bad idea. But I said, yeah, okay. And we got married, and you know, a few months later we were divorced. We stayed friends because we both always wanted to stay friends. I stayed friends with Ty because we just wanted to be friends. We didn't want this triple love affair thing because everybody was doing it back in those days. Everybody was switching partners all the time. It was terrible. It really tore that part of my generation. It really played a really hard part on the lives of all of us, and a lot of the people I know ended up being single and still are to this day. The ones that are still alive, and a lot of them aren't alive anymore, but there was a big division there where the guys and the girls, they just kind of all gave up on each other, and just said, I don't want to mess with it anymore. So, yeah, I was fortunate that Becky stayed friends, but I left. So I'd been there in Moab for, you know, 15 years or something, doing this whole thing, being a hippie. And I mean, I could tell you so many stories about when we went dumpster diving and all this kind of stuff that we did in Moab. Fill up a book.
Well, we got time.
Well, we just had this weird life.
Well, there's a lot more of your time in Moab that we need to talk about because, I mean, first of all, just some fun details. What was the name of that house that y'all lived in?
Well, I had my house and we called it Sunflower Plaza.
Yeah.
And this guy comes over one day who I didn't really know real well. His name was Scott Bentley.
Yeah.
And Scott had a friend named Brett, a brother named Brett.
Yeah.
Scott was the same age as me probably, but Brett was quite a bit younger. He was only like 16, whereas I was like 21.
Yeah.
But Brett was like kind of like Shannon. He was like way ahead of his age, and he hung out with all of us older people, totally as an equal.
Yeah.
And nobody saw him as the young guy really, even though we all knew he was. So, but Scott, his grandmother, who his family had a lot of money from uranium mines,
Mm.
and his grandmother had given him some money to buy a house and then to fix it up and flip it. So Scott bought this house, and he came over, and Scott was like way into Cannery Row
Mm-hmm.
and Tortilla Flat especially,
Mm-hmm.
and he was really into that whole idea of like all these guys hanging out together.
Mm-hmm.
But the action was actually over at my house. But he comes over and he says, "I bought this house. Will you guys come over and live over at my house?" And so we did. We just kind of like, okay, let's go. So we moved over to Scott's place called Bentleyville, and the idea was that we were going to fix this place up. Eventually, it got fixed up, but it took a long, long time for anybody to do that because none of us were particularly into fixing it up.
Mm-hmm.
We were just wanted to drink and hang out and party. So there were like 13 men that lived over there, me included, and Ty. Captain Crud was there part of the time, a bunch of people. And we just partied and drank and partied and drank. And, it really was something out of a book, like out of Tortilla Flat or something. Because we were all poets, and
Yeah.
living like that, we were very much into that whole bohemian. We didn't think of ourselves as bohemians. We were hippies,
Yeah.
but we lived there at Bentleyville for quite a while. It wasn't until we actually all moved out that Scott finally got the place fixed up. Really,
That's funny.
like he never put any pressure on any of us to do anything or anything. We were all just there, and it was an amazing time. It was, like if you go back and you read the book like Tortilla Flat or something, you have a much better understanding of what it was like for us than for me to try to tell you here in this little interview. But there was just, it was a band of brothers, and we all loved each other dearly. And we'd all would have died for each other, and that whole thing. And so those were good years. Women generally wouldn't come within a mile of the place because we were, we were just like, I mean, none of us were like the kind of men that would like overpower or rape or we weren't like that kind of guys, but we were just bizarre and crazy, and of course we were all lonesome for women, but none of us had one, so it's not a place for a good woman to be, sort of, and so eventually some of us started finding women on the outside, and that's kind of what happened with me, is I ended up going off with Becky, I think, and so yeah, Becky was a big part of the thing, and I'd been with her, and then it got real sad, the relationship between me and Becky and Ty, and I finally just like, I'm really sick of this, man,
Well, hold on. We got to slow down a little bit more too. Where do Sourdough Jim and Herschel come into the picture?
Well,
Because that's a really important part of the story that we got to talk about.
well, Sourdough Jim was in that period there while I was living in Bentleyville, and I think, and I know I'd been taking a bunch of acid or something, and I had this big black Labrador. I think his name was Red Dog, and I had Red Dog. I had painted him all up like an Indian pony, so like war paint on him, and I was just walking around with Red Dog, and there was this old man sitting on the step of his house, and Red Dog went running up to him, with his tail wagging, and the old man like petting him on the head and stuff. And so I walk up, introduce myself, and it's Sourdough Jim. And Sourdough Jim was like walking up on Gandalf. Really was. He had this old man, he was probably in his late 70s at the time. Big long gray beard, real long gray hair, and he was just a total character. I mean, he was one of the most interesting characters I've ever met. And he was this little old man who lived in his little old house. And he would do things like he would take cap off of a jar
Mm-hmm.
and he'd fill it up with water. And he'd leave those around his house for the cockroaches.
Mm-hmm.
So the cockroaches would have water. And he just loved all animals and stuff. And he was an old prospector guy. And that's how he had ended up in Moab. And I think he'd just kind of gone wacko because he lived over there by himself. And he'd been an entertainer at one point, and he did these little he'd do these little dance jigs and play his harmonica. He had a harmonica that he'd glued to an old cob of corn,
Uh-huh.
and so you couldn't see the harmonica, And he would like pull it out, and he'd say, "You want to see something corny?" He'd pull out the harmonica on the corn.
Okay, yeah.
He'd play the harmonica and dance, And I'd sit there and laugh, and we'd smoke cigarettes and stuff. And Jim became kind of my refuge because, Becky was like really kind of breaking my heart because I kept trying to like make this thing happen with her,
Mm-hmm.
and she kept going back on it, and she'd come back to me and then go back to her on her own, and so I kind of started with Jim, kind of ended up being like a refuge.
Mm-hmm.
Can we stop for a minute here?